In today's video, we'll be looking at a method I use to memorize law. There's an overwhelming amount of information that you need to memorize for law, and so you need to develop various techniques to memorize all this information. Now, one of the techniques I use is mind maps. Mind maps are very useful because it allows you to list all the main points and draw links between each of the main points. And drawing these links and coming to conclusions between these main points allows you to further develop your understanding of whatever subject you're doing. So here's an example of what I've done for lawmaking. And I've taken all the main parts of lawmaking, all the subtopics of lawmaking. So that is parliamentary legislation, delegated legislation, parliamentary controls, judicial legislation, law reform, EU law. All of these main points, I've taken them and I've see how they all connect and work together. Because this now, once I've got all this information in my head, I can now play around with all this information because I understand it. First of all, it'll all be memorized, the main points, because you'll be thinking about it for a long while, so it'll all be in your long-term memory. So that means you won't need to go over the main points again and again and again in a monotonous manner. So that'll just leave the finer details for you to memorize, and every time you learn the finer details, you memorize the finer details, you plug it in to your mind map. You find which section it fits into, and you plug it into your mind map, and you see where else those finer details, where else it affects any other main points. So the way I've set out my mind map is I've focused it around Parliament, because they are the supreme legislative body in the UK, and they take the important policies and it goes through this legislative stage, and that's basically where all the law starts to trickle from. This is the starting point of law in the UK, of legislation in the UK. It all starts from there. And then there's also the EU law, which is another complicated aspect, which also sort of affects parliamentary legislation. But because of Brexit, it makes things complicated. But EU law has an effect on parliamentary legislation and the different kinds of legislation that they produce. So you can see how EU law affects parliamentary legislation, and you see where delegated legislation comes into play. Parliament deals with all this important law over here, and the less important laws and details or details that are too complicated for Parliament to deal with is given to these other bodies that will make legislation on behalf of Parliament. And then you see how parliamentary controls come into it as well. So there you see how now you can you can visualize how delegated legislation comes into lawmaking. You can see the effects it has in there, or why it's in there. And then if you look back at Parliament's legislation, you can see here I've basically split it up. Basically, two things can happen to parliamentary legislation. It'll go to judges, who will then interpret the legislation, putting on their own twist, their own meanings, their own interpretation via one of these rules, and then that will create precedent, and that's where precedent comes in, and the whole hierarchy of courts, and then retia decidendi obiter dicta. And then legislation can be codified or consolidated or repealed by the Law Commission. So Law Commission also affects parliamentary legislation at a later state as well. And then there's law reform and the influences on Parliament. Now, this probably should have been above parliamentary legislation up here, but as you can see, there's loads of ways to set out and plan your mind map. It depends on which perspective you look at it from, which angle you look at it from, and the different links and connections you make between these subtopics. So here I list the influences on Parliament. And this will either make Parliament reform or the Law Commission reform a law or make and introduce a new law or update a new law. So that's what all these influences on Parliament will do. So everything in this mind map is linked. And one important key feature to notice is that I've used a lot of images and diagrams and pictures. And that is because these are very visual and it's easier to remember. It also shows the links between different subtopics and the links between different parts of lawmaking. Hopefully this video has been helpful and you can see how to make an effective mind map, or you've learned how effective mind maps can be. Just make sure that it's very visual. And there are various techniques that I encourage you to take to help memorize and understand the law. So go ahead, make mind maps for every other part of law.